Texas, July 4, 1945. The smoke from the mesquite pits hung low over Camp Wallace, thick and sweet, carrying with it the scent of something 18 German women hadn't experienced in years' abundance. Lena Becker stood at the compound's edge, watching American soldiers laugh as they flipped enormous slabs of brisket, ribs glistening under the Texas sun. Her hands trembled, not from fear, from something far more dangerous than fear-hope. The kind that breaks you when it turns out to be real. Before we continue, if you're enjoying these untold stories from World War II, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another piece of hidden history. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Now, let's get back to Camp Wallace, where something extraordinary was about to unfold. She could smell beef, real beef. Not the gray rationed scraps Berlin had offered in its final years. Not the thin soup that passed for protein in the months before Germany's collapse. This was meat cooked with purpose, with pride, with an excess that seemed almost obscene. Behind her, Ingrid Schneider whispered in German, "Is this real?" Lena didn't answer. She couldn't, because the answer terrified her. If this abundance was real, then everything they'd been told about America, about the starving enemy barely clinging to survival, was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else had been? Colonel James Morrison had made the announcement 3 days prior. Independence Day, a real Texas barbecue. No rations, no limits. Eat until you can't eat anymore. The women had received the news with suspicious silence, veterans of disappointment. Trained by years of propaganda and deprivation not to trust promises of plenty. But now, watching Sergeant Bill Crawford slice through brisket that seemed to melt under its own weight, watching American soldiers pile plates higher than seemed physically possible, Lena felt something crack inside her chest. The propaganda was shattering in real time. There was nothing she could do to stop it. By 1945, Germany's food situation had become catastrophic in ways most Americans couldn't comprehend. While the United States produced over 1.8 billion pounds of beef, annually enough to feed its soldiers steak, regularly Germany's meat rations had shrunk to barely 300 grams per person per week. The Nazi regime had promised self-sufficiency through conquest, but by the war's end, German civilians were living on 1,500 calories daily, half what the average American consumed. The women at Camp Wallace had experienced this firsthand. Years of hunger etched into their bodies, hollowing cheeks, thinning hair, hands that shook when lifting anything heavier than a spoon. Lena had worked in Berlin's civil administration before her conscription into auxiliary services in 1944. She'd seen the logistics reports, watched the ration quotas shrink month after month, understood that the regime was choosing to keep civilians hungry, scarcity as control, deprivation as policy. When bombs fell on Berlin, when buildings collapsed into rubble and ash, the hunger remained constant, the one reliable thing in a world dissolving into chaos. She'd been captured near Hamburg in April 1945. Processed through British facilities, then transferred to American custody. The journey across the Atlantic had been uncomfortable, but not cruel. The food had been adequate. But adequate was a universe away from what she was seeing now. Camp Wallace held roughly 400 German prisoners by July 1945, mostly men. But 18 women who'd served in auxiliary roles, communication specialists, administrative staff, a few nurses. They'd arrived in March, settling into a routine of waiting. Waiting for paperwork. Waiting for ships. Waiting for a Germany that no longer existed to become stable enough for repatriation. The American guards were professional, often friendly, maintaining Geneva Convention standards with a casualness that itself felt strange. No brutality, no deliberate cruelty. Just men doing a job, treating prisoners like temporary inconveniences rather than permanent enemies. Margaret Vogel, 42, had been a teacher in Hamburg before the war consumed everything. Her husband died in North Africa. Her son vanished somewhere on the Eastern Front. She'd learned not to hope, not to expect, not to believe in anything beyond the next meal and the day after that. Standing beside Lena now, watching the barbecue preparations, she felt tears forming before she understood why. "My father used to smoke meat," she whispered. "Christmas, Easter, the whole house would smell like this wood smoke and spices. I'd forgotten that smell was possible." Sergeant Crawford had been preparing since midnight. Brisket required 12 hours minimum low heat, constant smoke, patience that couldn't be rushed. He'd requisitioned mesquite wood, hauled it himself, built fires in pits, dug deep into Texas soil. His grandfather had taught him this craft, passed down through generations. A philosophy as much as a technique. You judge a civilization by how it treats people when it has plenty. Poor times, everyone struggles. But abundance, that's when you see what people truly value. Crawford knew most Americans took this abundance for granted. They'd never known the kind of hunger that made you dream about food, that turned eating into obsession rather than routine. The German women were called forward at noon. They walked across the compound in a hesitant line, 18 ghosts in gray prisoner uniforms. Eyes wide with something between disbelief and desperate hunger. The serving tables stretched 30 feet long brisket, ribs, chicken, sausage, sides that seemed impossible in their variety. Potato salad, coleslaw, beans slow-cooked with bacon, cornbread still warm from ovens. And at the end, visible through heat, shimmer, desserts, pies, cakes, cookies that looked homemade rather than institutional. Lena reached the front of the line first. Crawford stood there with enormous tongs, grinning with the pride of someone who knew his craft was about to speak for itself. "How much?" Lena asked in careful English. Crawford's grin widened. "Alain? That's not the right question. Right question is, how hungry are you?" He loaded her plate. Brisket for thick slices. Ribs 3 bones, still steaming. Chicken thigh and drumstick. Sausage 2 links split down the middle. Lena stared at meat piled higher than she'd seen in 6 months. Higher than her family in Berlin had eaten in the war's final year. Her hands shook, holding the plate. She moved down the line mechanically, added sides without thinking, took cornbread that left butter on her fingers. By the time she reached her table, the plate was so loaded she had to concentrate just to carry it. Around her, other women were receiving the same impossible portions. Each one staring at their plates with identical expressions, disbelief transitioning slowly into the terrifying understanding that this wasn't a trick. This was real. Lena sat, lifted her fork, cut into brisket that separated with no resistance, brought the meat to her mouth. The taste hit her like a physical force knot just because the meat was perfectly cooked. Though it was, but because it represented something she'd forgotten could exist. Food prepared with care. Abundance given freely. Generosity that didn't calculate cost or measure worthiness. She felt tears starting, hot and unstoppable, blurring her vision as she chewed. Around the table, the same scene replicated. Ingrid bit into a rib and began sobbing immediately full, wrenching sobs, sauce coating her fingers, shoulders shaking. Margaret ate methodically, tears carving lines down her face, dripping onto her plate, mixing with sauce and fat. Anna Mueller, 30, from Frankfurt, set down her fork 3 times to compose herself. Then picked it up again because stopping felt impossible. The crying spread through the group like contagion, not sadness, something deeper. The sound of propaganda dissolving, of lies recognized, of enemies discovering that everything they'd been taught was backwards. American soldiers at nearby tables watched with expressions mixing confusion and dawning comprehension. These weren't tears of distress. This was catharsis. This was 18 women realizing simultaneously that they'd been lied to about everything that mattered, that the enemy was generous while their own government had kept them desperate. That abundance was real, and the deprivation they'd suffered was choice, not necessity. Sergeant Crawford approached with sweet tea, poured glasses with gentle efficiency. "Y'all all right?" he asked through the interpreter. Lena wiped her eyes, nodded. "We're not accustomed to this, to food this good. It's plentiful." Crawford's weathered face softened. Barbecue isn't just food, it's tradition, culture, a way of showing respect and hospitality. "My granddaddy taught me to judge a man by how he treats people at his table. Rich, poor, friend, enemy, doesn't matter. You feed them right." Lena absorbed this, understood it represented philosophy as much as cooking. "In Germany," she said carefully, "we were told America was weak, starving, unable to sustain the war effort. That victory was inevitable because you lacked resources." Crawford smiled sadly. "And what do you think now?" Lena gestured at her plate, at the abundance surrounding them. "I think we were lied to about everything." After 30 minutes, something remarkable happened. Ingrid stood, her plate somehow empty despite being impossibly full minutes before. She walked toward the serving line with determination bordering on desperation. Crawford watched her approach, saw her tear-stained face, understood before she spoke. "More," Ingrid said in broken English, holding out her plate. "Please, sir, give us more." Crawford reloaded her plate. More brisket, more ribs, more of everything. Then other women began standing, forming a line, plates in hand, voices mixing German and English into a chorus that transcended language. "Mer, bit, may we have more?" And from Margaret, the reserved teacher from Hamburg, voice breaking, "Give us more." They returned 4 times on average. Each woman making pilgrimage to the serving line again and again, eating until full. Then eating more because the food was there and real and represented years of deprivation finally answered. American soldiers watched this repeated journey with evolving expressions, confusion, becoming understanding, becoming something approaching reverence. They were witnessing ideology collapse under the weight of Texas barbecue. Colonel Morrison stood at the gathering's edge, watching his prisoners cry and eat and discover abundance. His executive officer, Captain Reynolds, looked troubled. "Sir, they're going to make themselves sick." Morrison replied quietly, "Let them. They're learning something more important than any lecture could teach. That America fights from abundance. That our values include generosity, even toward enemies. Every bite they take is propaganda crumbling." By evening, the women sat in satisfied exhaustion, stomachs distended, hands sticky with sauce, faces marked by tears that had finally stopped. The feast had lasted 3 hours. They'd consumed quantities that seemed impossible at the meal's start. And something fundamental had shifted. They carried themselves differently now, shoulders back, heads up, moving like people who'd been reminded they were human rather than just prisoners. That night, sitting under Texas stars impossibly bright in darkness, untouched by war, Lena spoke with Sergeant Crawford through the interpreter. "Can I ask you something?" Crawford said. "Today, when y'all were crying, coming back for more, what was that about?" Lena considered how to explain years of hunger and propaganda to someone who'd never experienced either. "Have you ever been truly hungry? Not skip lunch hungry, but genuinely uncertain where your next meal comes from?" Crawford thought about Depression-era childhood. Lean years even in Texas. Some, not like war hunger probably. Lena nodded. "Then you understand hunger becomes psychological. You dream about food constantly. It becomes evidence the world has gone wrong. In Germany, the last 2 years especially, we were perpetually hungry. Not starving, the regime managed calories carefully, but never satisfied, always wanting. They told us this was because of enemy blockades, because the world was jealous of German success." She paused, finding words for experiences that resisted language. "I worked in civil service. I saw the numbers. I knew the regime was choosing to keep us hungry, using scarcity as control. The hunger wasn't necessity, it was policy." She looked at Crawford directly. "And then today, endless meat. given freely to prisoners who'd fought against America. No rationing, no limits. Just feed everyone until satisfied, then feed them more. That generosity shattered everything we'd been taught. Crawford pulled something from his pakia folded piece of paper. "This is my family's barbecue sauce recipe. For generations, my granddaddy, to my daddy, to me. I'm giving it to you." Lena took the paper, surprised. Why? Because food is culture. And culture is worth sharing. Because you understand what this means better than most Americans do. And because, someday, maybe there'll be barbecue in Germany. If there is, I hope it's because you remembered today. In the weeks following, the women began asking Crawford for recipes, techniques, the knowledge that had created that feast. He started teaching evening sessions in the mess hall. German women taking meticulous notes while an American sergeant demonstrated smoking techniques and the philosophy of patience that turned tough meat tender through time and attention. Margaret became his most dedicated student, filling notebooks with precise German script, understanding these weren't just recipes, but cultural DNA, values made tangible. September brought repatriation orders. The women would return to a Germany that existed now only as rubble and occupation zones. Carol Morrison arranged a farewell barbecue, smaller, intimate, a bookend to their Texas imprisonment. They ate with less crying this time, having learned to expect generosity, but emotion remained. Gratitude mixed with sadness for leaving the place that had treated them better than anywhere else in their war-shattered lives. Lena gave Crawford a carved wooden plaque made by a prisoner in the camp workshop. German and English text, in gratitude to Sergeant Crawford, who taught us the enemy can be generous, that abundance is meant to be shared, and that humanity transcends borders. From the German women prisoners, September 1945, Crawford's throat tightened. "Ladies, I was just cooking barbecue." Lena corrected him. "You were demonstrating civilization." The next morning, trucks carried them away. Lena clutched mesquite seeds Crawford had given her. Takes years before they're big enough for smoking wood. But mesquite is patient like that, and watched Camp Wallace recede into distance, the place where they'd been prisoners, the place where they'd been treated with dignity, the place where crying over barbecue taught them more about civilization than any textbook ever could. Berlin, 1975. Lena Becker was 64, standing in a small garden behind a reconstructed apartment building. In the center grew a mesquite, tree improbable in German climate, carefully maintained, producing wood that several old women used for a tradition that had become minor legend. Every July 4th, survivors of Camp Wallace gathered here and cooked. Real Texas barbecue. Recipes from notebooks filled with Crawford's instructions 30 years prior. The food was never quite right. German beef wasn't Texas beef, but the ritual mattered more than perfect recreation. Ingrid stirred sauce in a large pot. Margaret's daughter attended, carrying her mother's notebook. Anna and 5 other original survivors formed the gathering's core, joined by children, grandchildren, neighbors curious about this strange American tradition transplanted to German soil. "Tell us again," a young woman asked Ingrid's granddaughter, maybe 25. "Tell us about the barbecue." So Lena told the story she'd told dozens of times over 3 decades, about heat and smoke and meat abundant beyond imagination, about crying while eating because food proved the enemy was generous. That propaganda had lied. That deprivation was choice rather than necessity. About returning again and again for more, begging for abundance to continue, experiencing in real time the dissolution of ideology under observable truths. Wait. She gestured at the mesquite tree, at smoke rising from their makeshift pit. "This tree grew from seeds Sergeant Crawford gave me at departure. Took 15 years before it provided smoking wood. But now it produces, and we use it to remember that the enemy showed us kindness. That abundance shared is better than scarcity hoarded. That the post-war world we rebuilt should prioritize feeding people over controlling them." Lena read Crawford's latest letter as a cool Berlin evening settled. 30 years after a Texas POW camp taught her that barbecue was philosophy made edible. The sergeant, now 73, in San Antonio wrote proudly that their mesquite tree thrived and their traditions endured. She returned the letter to decades of correspondence, blending recipes and wisdom. Around her, friends and family ate, talked, and celebrated an American ritual transformed on German soil. Lena realized wars sometimes end not with treaties but with shared meals, with smoke rising from gardens once tended by enemies who taught them generosity, abundance, and the sacred work of feeding others.